Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left. With me in this episode is Albert Lee. Albert Lee is running for Congress in Oregon's 3rd District, which is some of Portland and some of the surrounding areas, and he is running as an open socialist. So in this conversation, Albert and I talk about the 3rd District, who the incumbent is, what are his main policy objectives, running a campaign during COVID, running as a socialist, and the role of Bernie. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Albert Lee. So with me is Albert Lee. Albert, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I want you basically, if you could, just to give us a bit of background about who you are, where you come from, and kind of lead us into why you decided that you were going to run for Congress, which is, for I think a lot of people, a crazy decision. But why did you ultimately decide to run for Congress? Who are you? Kind of introduce yourselves to the audience.
Certainly. So my name is Albert Lee. I'm running to represent the people of the 3rd District of Oregon to Congress. A little bit about me. I am a 6th-generation American and an immigrant at the same time. I was born in South Korea, where my African-American Army dad met my mom, my Korean mom, during the middle of the Vietnam War. Now, I grew up in working-class St. Louis, North County, St. Louis, next door to Ferguson. And I grew up a latchkey kid. My dad was deployed for most of my childhood, and my mom worked two jobs to put my sister and me into Catholic school because our public schools were truly separate and unequal. Now, we grew up pretty much with one parent throughout the majority of my life. When I was in high school, my dad came back home to us. The Army had done this whole reduction in force thing right before he retired. And unfortunately, with him, he brought a lot of demons, which included domestic violence, which led to our flight from St. Louis. I was 16 years old. I drove my mom and my sister east to an uncertain safety. And we just headed out on the highway and ended up in a battered women's shelter outside of Pittsburgh. Wow. Now, with the cycle of violence, this was before the Violence Against Women Act. We ended up returning home only to have to leave again. This time we headed west from shelter to shelter. Eventually a kind family took us in and helped us to get back on our feet. All said, I went to 5 different high schools in 3 different states. Now, with a lot of help from a lot of strangers and some friends, we were able to get stabilized, to get back on our feet. I would move on to become a 1st-generation college grad, served in the United States Army, then worked in international trade before heading out to Oregon. Now, I came back to the East Coast to go to law school, and then after law school, I worked for a small legal research company, and then with the American Bar Association before meeting my wife and heading back west to Oregon to raise a family and to start a business. I would eventually move on to become one of the deans at Portland Community College. Now, I've stepped down from that position in order to make this run, and I know that for a lot of people, even contemplating the thought or the idea of being running to challenge to represent the people that you live with in a district is insane. But for me, what I see is a need. I see a a lot of serious crises that have been allowed to fester and grow here in our district, across the country and around the world, that require bold action now, and not just inspirational and aspirational words. So, I'm running to represent the people of the 3rd District because, first of all, democracy requires choice, and it's something that we simply haven't had here in over a generation. Again, we face a lot of crises, including a homelessness crisis, the lack of affordable housing and living wages, and a climate emergency that has really only gotten lip service. Now, in addition to that, I believe in the basic tenets of the party when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it's time that we uplift some new voices from some other backgrounds, from some other lived experiences, to represent us here in the most diverse district of our state. And lastly, most importantly, I think it's time that we end this oligarchy, this rule by elite multimillionaire career politicians, and replace them with citizen representatives who know the struggle, who won't take corporate contributions, and who will truly represent and fight for the people.
So tell us a little bit about the district that you're aiming to represent, and a bit of the politics of it. What who represents it now? Why make the challenge to them, and kind of the way that you see the political landscape in the 3rd District?
Certainly. So the 3rd District is a plus 24 on the Cook Partisan Voting Index, D plus 24, meaning that it's a very, very blue district, a very, very safe seat, and a very, very progressive, if you like that word, district. Now, we have been represented by the same representative for over 24 years.
Wow.
Now, the last 2 representatives, it's been 40 years with 2 different representatives. There has been a lot that has changed in our district over the last 24 years. And again, I hearken back to what I was talking about earlier. There are a lot of different issues that have been allowed to fester and grow. Now, don't get me wrong. The incumbent, Earl Blumenauer, since you asked me to name him, has been a decent vote for the most part, a decent blue vote, but he's a corporate Dem. And I know that for a lot of people, they don't realize that, because they look at the cute little bow tie and the glasses and, his whole theme of bikes and cannabis. But the reality is we are in one of the safest, most progressive seats. We need to have somebody that's going to push the party left within this seat, instead of somebody that's going to be a center-left Democrat that's going to, toe the party line. One of the problems that I think that the Democrats have nationally is it's hard to distinguish the Democratic Party from the Republican Party. They're basically 2 sides of the same corporate party.
Yeah.
And the Democrats have really lost their progressive roots. They have lost that left-leaning fire. And we have seen with the rise of Bernie Sanders in 2015, the Squad in 2018, that there is a fervor, a gusto for a new left. And this cycle, we have hundreds of candidates around the country that have stood up to the call, that have followed in the footsteps of Sanders, of Ocasio-Cortez, of Omar, to really raise the voices and uplift the voices of so many people that have not been heard. So here in our district, we're a tale of 2 cities, really. We have a very wealthy subset of folks, mainly working in high tech and various nice corporate positions. But then we have a solid working class that is truly struggling and has been, for a generation. And then we cannot dismiss the fact that our state is one of the leaders in homelessness, and we have such a large houseless population that is not being serviced, that is not being taken care of. These are things. These are the challenges that we face, and quite frankly, our representative has not stepped up to those challenges.
So what are the main policy objectives of your campaign? I mean, obviously housing is going to be a part of that, given the poor position of, and this is the Portland area, right? Am I right?
Right. So the 3rd district encompasses the majority of Portland east of the Willamette River. So the Willamette River kind of bisects the city. It has a little bit of northwest and southwest Portland as well. And then it goes east all the way up to Mount Hood. So it takes in Gresham, Troutdale, Fairview, and then down south, the northern part of Clackamas County, which includes areas like Molalla and Estacada.
Okay. So you got, housing as I'm guessing housing is a basic right. Is that a
Housing
position
is a human right. I mean,
Yes.
the United Nations have talked about this for 40 years. The reality is we cannot have people living in tents, living rough on the street. If we do not have, if they do not have housing, quite frankly, it is the position and the job of the government to supply that housing because it is a human right. And quite frankly, we have looked at housing first programs and policies in Salt Lake City, in New Orleans, in Scandinavia, and we can see the benefit for the individual, the houseless individual, as well as for the general society as a whole. And then you can take a look at it and you can make the economic argument that it is actually economically more efficient to provide the housing than it is to take care of all of the negative externalities that come from houselessness.
And your position on healthcare, same thing, healthcare right,
Yes.
Medicare for all.
Healthcare is a human right. It must be. And when you made a housing first program and policy with a universal healthcare program, that will do so much to eradicate our houselessness problem, an issue, and care for individuals. In addition, when we look at our current COVID crisis, what we see is that our current employee-based healthcare system is failing us. When we have millions of people, tens of millions of people who have lost their jobs due to the crisis, and now the response is, well, you got COBRA, and that, quite frankly, is not a remedy. And I am dismayed by corporate Democrats who want to subsidize or bolster the payment of COBRA instead of providing what is simply more efficient to do, which is to provide a universal healthcare system and get rid of the middlemen, get rid of all of those private health insurance companies, and focus all of that money into what is needed, which is the actual healthcare, as opposed to the parasitic waste of those layers.
And your position on the climate crisis?
Yes, obviously, all of these things are kind of interrelated.
Sure.
Again, when we look at the COVID crisis demonstrates something that our corporate-backed politicians have been denying, which is that there's nothing that we can do. Now, the COVID crisis has forced us all to stop consuming fossil fuels at the rate that we have been doing. And we have seen dramatic changes within the air quality around the world because of the stay-at-home orders around the world. It isn't that we can't do something, it is that we lack the political will. And we lack the political will because of the money in politics, right? So I look at the money in politics as really being the root issue for all of the crises we face, where you talk about the climate emergency or the lack of Medicare for all, or the endless wars that we have. They're all rooted in the fact that there are special interests, wealthy special interests, that effectively bribe our politicians, not our representatives, our politicians, to do the wrong thing and not really do what's in the best interest of the people, the country, and the world. And the only way that you're going to really affect change is to replace those politicians with citizen representatives who will not take that corporate contribution, who will not take those bribes.
And that's a position that you've taken. You are not taking any corporate donations. Or
no, we are not.
Like
and in fact, so this is the thing that distinguishes myself from the incumbent, because a lot of people say, well, on paper, you guys look the same. And that's exactly it. There's a difference between being a lip service progressive and actually walking the walk and talking that you talk. So, for instance, our incumbent talks about wanting to overturn Citizens United, wanting to have publicly financed campaigns so that we can diversify our leadership and that we can bring in more people and more voices. But the fact of the matter is, he, has taken 65% of his contributions have come from corporations. And when you tack on, PACs on top of that, it goes over 90%. Now, he's outraised us 10-1. But with if you erase the PAC and if you erase the corporate contributions, we've raised the same amount of money. So if you were somebody who really believes in publicly financed campaigns, believes that we need to get money out of politics, why are you taking the money, right? And it also demonstrates that, we have a significantly uneven playing field here when I'm being outraised 10-1 by doing the right thing, by not taking the corporate contributions.
Absolutely. So you're running for the Democratic in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
But you're a member of the Democratic Socialists of America.
Yes.
And you're running openly as a socialist.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And so what does that mean for you and for your campaign? How has it affected you? Has it energized some and diminished the interest of others? How have you seen the position that you've taken with the potentially scary S word? In terms of how it's affected your campaign or how it's oriented your campaign, let's say.
Certainly. So the scary S word. I'm 45 years old, and I know that for folks my age and older, that is a scary word. We grew up in the Cold War. I remember having the nuclear drills where we like duck and cover, like that's going to save your ass during a nuclear holocaust. But for those that are younger than me, that word isn't as scary. And here's the other thing. In this district, we are so far to the left that that word really doesn't really scare a whole lot of folks. Sure, you're going to have a subset of especially older voters that are hesitant with the word. But when we talk about it, I mean, we're talking about things that a lot of people agree with. I talk to conservatives, independents, and liberals, if you want to call them that. And I ask them, what do you want out of your government? Do you want a government that works for you, or do you want a government that, works for those at the very top? And the answer is always the same. And it's just like, I want a government that's going to work for me. And that's ultimately what we're talking about. All of these things that we struggle with when we talk about the immense wealth gap, when we talk about the lack of a living wage, these are things that have been conducted because regular everyday people have not had the voice necessary in their government. And people that have more money, have more influence, really make the call, call the shots. That's how come we have a minimum wage that has remained flat for 40 years. And actually the buying power is diminished tremendously. That's why we have so many people struggling, and we have such a high concentration of wealth at the very top, which is quite frankly extremely unsustainable. And if we do not address this politically, I fear that it will be addressed otherwise.
And in that sense, it's as the sign of the times might be, the cure may be worse than the crisis.
Yeah.
But so speaking of crisis, I'm very curious how running a campaign in this present moment is very different than running a campaign normally. So how has the crisis changed your campaign, and how have you sort of dealt with the social distancing rules and all those kinds of things? How has it changed your campaign, and has it and what do you see as the effect it's going to have on the election, both on election day and up to then?
Certainly. So we are just under a month away from the election. The primary is May 19th, and since 6 or 7 weeks ago, we've had to convert to an all virtual campaign, which means that we're doing a lot of virtual town halls. We're trying to do as many interviews as possible. We're trying to phone bank and text as much as possible to reach out to folks. And then, the only thing that we have out in the public are our yard signs. And unfortunately, without the tremendous amount of money that our incumbent has, we won't be able to do the variety of different advertisements. We will try to do as much social media buys as we can, but the simple fact of the matter is we don't have the funds to compete in that way. So it's a lot of word of mouth. It's a lot of just trying to reach as many people as possible and do our best with social media. Now, one of the things that is leveling here in Oregon is that we were the first state that had vote by mail. And we've had that and we've practiced that for a very long time. And so with that vote by mail system, people are starting to receive the voters' pamphlets. And in the voters' pamphlet, they're going to see a little snippet about myself as well as the incumbent. And so they're going to have an opportunity to see a picture of me and a little bit of information. And if they're curious, they'll be able to move on to our website and our social media to see more. Unfortunately, that's the only major touch that we're going to have. We've requested since last summer debates with the incumbent, who's refused all the way until the very beginning of March, where he agreed that he would do a debate with us at the when somebody asked at the Oregon Education Association's conference. Unfortunately, with the COVID crisis, he's kind of shied away from that. So, you know, we're ready and willing to do that debate at any time.
I was going to say, you think it'd be easier to have, you just do a call and record it.
Exactly.
Doesn't seem too difficult to me.
So yeah, I mean, long story short, this definitely has placed a monkey wrench into what we were planning on doing for the last 2 months of this campaign in the primary. And we're going to have to, make the adjustments that we can and hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
How do you see, and what is your position on the sort of response to the whole COVID-19 crisis? There's a lot to be said about the failure of the administration aspect of it, but there's also, I think, in some ways, a fairly glaring failure on Congress's part to do what is adequate. And you're seeing a division in Congress between those of the squad and on the more progressive side, and their proposals about $2,000 a month and rent and mortgage furloughs and things like that. So, kind of give us a flavor of how you would respond, or what you would support if in Congress at this point.
Well, I got to tell you, the first thing I got to say is that we have a Congress that is filled with the 1%, with the oligarchy, and it is demonstrated by the decisions that they've made from the very beginning. When the stock market started crashing, the immediate thing was to input of trillions of dollars into the stock market for no other reason but to save the assets of the ultra wealthy. And then when it was time to make a discussion about what we're going to do for the people, that trillion of dollars of injection into Wall Street, that came without any kind of discussion or deliberation. But when it was time to talk about the people, it was we had to spend 4 or 5 days, and the end result was another $500 billion given no strings attached to corporations, and the promise of some limited means-based or tested way of providing $1,200 one time for the rest of us. Right there, that is an indication that those folks are out of touch. They do not understand how the rest of us live, what we suffer from, what we need. The simple fact of the matter is, at this time in this unprecedented crisis, what we need is an emergency economic support of at least $2,000 per person and $500 per dependent until the crisis is over, and at least 6 months thereafter. We're seeing businesses, we're seeing in a whole bunch of different things just falling apart, and we have a government that's just not being responsive to this, and they continue to focus on providing fixes for those at the top. I mean, the whole PPP deal was geared towards small businesses, but you saw that the businesses that secured all the funds were the Ruth's Chris, Shake Shacks. Shake Shack, I think, eventually got guilted into returning their $10 million. But folks like Ruth's Chris, we're divided into 2 subsidiaries, so we need $10 million for each. And again, that doesn't trickle down to the people on the front end. I mean, they have furloughed and fired the people at the bottom. So again, the people are left holding the bag. This feels like a repetition of 2008 with the financial crisis, where we bailed out the very people who caused that speculative decline. And then we bailed out the auto industry. And then when it was time to bail out Main Street and the people, we were like, y'all are on your own. So we gotta stop that. We've got to get to a point where we have representatives that really are going to work for the people, and stop providing socialism for those at the top and the harshest capitalism for those at the bottom.
So I wonder, this is potentially a loaded question, but how did, Bernie Sanders was for many of us, I think, a wind in our sails. And, there are a lot of people, including AOC and many of the other members of the squad who said it was Bernie Sanders, run in 2016 that encouraged me to go. Do you count yourself among that group of people who, were inspired by Bernie Sanders' run for office to run yourself?
Yes. So, in 2015, it was the first time that I ever gave a contribution to a politician, to a
Ditto.
candidate, because for me, politician equated to liar, crook, and thief. But with Bernie, I saw somebody that was truly fighting for us, for the regular everyday American. And it wasn't just me, my wife, the same thing. She never gave money to a politician. Mm-hmm. And we ended up giving multiple times. We ended up knocking on doors for Bernie. We ended up making phone calls, all those scary things that, regular folks just don't want to do. Yeah. We were doing that because we really believed in him. And then we saw how the political machine works. We saw how the primary was taken from him.
Yeah.
And initially we were dejected. We looked at it and we were like, well, what do we do now? The system continues. The status quo is maintained. But we took what he said, which was not me, us. We need to get involved. And it was because of his campaign that I started to get more activated within civic life and within political life. So I joined the Democratic Party. I became an elected PCP, which is a precinct committee person, the lowest elected position. I became elected state central committee delegate. I joined the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialist of America. That was the political stuff. Then I got involved on the civic side, and I got on to the city of Portland. The city council appointed me to the Citizens Review Committee, which is a 11-member panel that does basically a citizen appellate review of police actions to try to right some wrongs with interactions with our citizens. I got involved with the Portland Police Bureau's recruitment and hiring. So I was one of the civilians that sat in, and my point was we need to make sure that we don't introduce any more fascists into our police department. We need to make sure that we can vet these folks and make sure we don't bring in any more bad seeds into our police. I've never been a proponent for the police department. I understand the function as it is today. I don't necessarily agree. We can talk a little bit more about that later. I got involved with TriMet's Transit Equity Advisory Committee. In my capacity as one of the deans at Portland Community College, I represented PCC on that board, and we looked at the disparate impacts that marginalized folks and our students would face with any kind of changes within that bus and rail system. And then I got involved with the Giving Tree, which works with folks in affordable low-income housing and SROs downtown, and really trying to build out community, rebuilding their own humanity after folks living on the street and being dehumanized. It's a practice that you need to bring people together, re-socialize folks. So I did a lot of different things, and it didn't really feel like work. It felt like being part of the community. It felt like I was doing what Bernie wanted, which is to have us all participate and get involved and get engaged within our community. So yeah, I 100%. I think that it was Bernie Sanders that inspired me to do all of those things and to do this as well.
So there is you have in some ways this insider perspective on at least the Oregon Democratic Party and some of the ways that it works, and we've seen in some ways the way that the National Democratic Party is oriented and ultimately works, both with the leaks from the 2016 campaign, but and it just in some ways the relatively open campaign against Bernie Sanders this time, specifically after South Carolina and the kind of maneuvering that happened from people like Barack Obama and others to kind of stack the deck and to rob Bernie Sanders, I think, of the momentum that he was gaining. And so, you're running to be a representative with the Democratic Party, but obviously see problems with the Democratic Party. And so, there's definitely a theory that what the Democratic Party needs is a whole swath of new politicians, and that will reorient the party back towards a more progressive bent that it might have had after the New Deal and things like that. And there is, some legitimacy to, I think, that theory. And there's been some work that's been done by the Squad and other progressive members and by Bernie Sanders, obviously, to move the party's positions in a more leftward direction. But I think you do still see that the Democratic Party is, as you described, fundamentally one half of the capitalist party, the oligarchy party, the ruling class party, for lack of a better term. And so, how do you kind of see your role in this campaign and with the Democratic Party, given what you also know about the Democratic Party?
Certainly, that's a very good question. I think that one of the things that people have been talking about since 2015 is, dem enter versus dem exit.
Yeah.
In 2015, 2016, I was on the side of dem enter, and I continued to do so. And I really, truly believe that our candidate was going to get a fair shake this time around. But we saw, again, that the coordination between mainstream media, the coordination between those establishment candidates. I mean, from the very beginning, we had over 20 candidates, presidential candidates, enter the field, the majority of them being establishment party Democrats who would take some aspect of the Sanders campaign and claim it as their own, yet distort it. So it did a couple of different things. It muddied the water. It made it diluted a lot of the things that we were fighting for as a progressive front through Bernie's campaign. And it brought in a lot of noise and static. And it was shameful the way that mainstream media would focus on some of these, D-lister candidates and give them so much time on air. And it was almost as if to deny Bernie any time on air. And again, I went to all four of his rallies here in Oregon in 2015, 2016, and each one was sold out, tens of thousands of people. I went to the one in Tacoma, Washington, at the Tacoma Dome, 18,000 people sold out. None of that stuff made it onto the news. But you saw various candidates from Biden to Buttigieg to Delaney get significant airtime. And they would do very tight shots of their rallies with 30 people. That is the kind of thing that both the party and the mainstream media worked in concert to dismiss the Sanders campaign. And with that, we are provided an indication that, again, this party is about self-preservation. This party is about maintaining the status quo, a status quo that allows a certain subset of the party to continue to enrich themselves at all of our expenses. Now, what's my role in this? So two things. Number one, I think that the Democratic Party was foolish. It was foolish, and it continues to be foolish in the way that it has handled the Sanders campaign. We've got the state of New York trying to take his name off of the ballot, trying to deny the last vestige of democracy and democratic action so that they can ensure that they don't have to listen to a subset of those that are still remaining in the party. And should they be successful in doing steps like that in New York, should they be successful in continuing to do the manipulation that they do, it's going to be at their own detriment. The party will break down. There will be a mass exodus of folks on the left, people that are going to be disillusioned by this corporatist party. I'm trying to save this cohesion of the left, this coalition, and it seems like the party wants the votes, but they don't want to listen to the coalition. And you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have it so that you have a unified block of voters without listening to your block. And so I think what the Democrats are doing is foolhardy, and I think it's to their own jeopardy and to their own detriment. Now, I am one of hundreds of progressive candidates that have become the foot soldiers of the movement, right? We have lost our leadership. We have lost the head. And quite frankly, I'm disappointed at Bernie for his endorsement of Biden without any kind of concessions whatsoever.
Right.
I'm still scratching my head trying to figure that one out. But, we may have lost the head, but from the feet, we have hundreds of people ready to take on the mantle. Now, if we are not successful in getting 10 or 15 or more representatives, we get that many representatives in this cycle, I would consider that a success. I would think that would create a voting bloc that is provided that 3% leverage necessary in order to truly affect change. So that's what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for the people. I'm fighting to see if we can somehow break through this corporatist one party, two sides of one party system, and make the changes that are necessary in order for us to take back this government, in order for us to have a government that's going to be of, by, and for the people.
That's perfect. What I have kind of said, the analysis that I brought on the podcast, I had an episode, Bernie's out, what now? And to me, I shared your disappointment. I was really frustrated by the sort of immediate endorsement without a sort of concessions. I think you are hearing a bit now that there were some kind of stipulations in terms of a climate deal and something like that. We'll see what actually comes out of that. We're talking about Joe Biden, but I wanted to ask you sort of two feelings. One, sort of how do you really feel about Joe Biden being the nominee of the Democratic Party? And the second thing is, I think that Bernie Sanders, if he wants to sort of have one Hail Mary last pass at having even larger effect on the American political system, what he would do is wait for the end of the election. So stump for Biden because you don't want to be the spoiler that gets Trump elected. But whether or not Biden gets elected, which I still think is a very much an open question, there's definitely a path for Trump to get elected, that Bernie Sanders start a third party. The American Labor Party or the Progressive Party, or what, I don't care what the name is, but that there be a third party. And maybe it's DSA, maybe it's just the Democratic Socialists of America finally move from the platform of calling for the formation of a third party to being the third party that they want to form. So the question, seeing as you are an outsider, I think in the campaign, and I think the party sort of sees you as the left primaried. That is potentially sowing discord amongst the other members of the Democratic Party, making it more difficult for somebody like, why would you raise this kind of stink in a solidly Democratic district? You're kind of spoiling it. We're trying to fight Republicans. Why are we fighting amongst each other? And I think in some ways you can legitimately see the deck stacked against you. So would you, if DSA or Bernie Sanders were to start a third party, leave the Democratic Party and join that party and work to form that party, or are you like dead set committed to moving the Democratic Party left? Either of those, I mean, those are two legitimate positions. There's no judgment for me either way, but I'm sort of curious about the long-term strategy that you have given this potential starting of a third party.
Yeah, so I'll start off with the Joe Biden question. I have not endorsed Joe Biden. If you look at my Twitter, you can see where I stand on that.
Right.
I think that he is an ineffective and a very weak candidate, probably even weaker than Clinton was in 2016.
Sure,
now,
okay.
I have serious concerns about him for several reasons. The first and foremost is his mental capacity.
Yeah.
There are absolutely clear signs of mental incapacity, and I fear a puppet state run from behind, like we had in Reagan's second tenure in his.
That'd be the third Obama.
Right. So
term.
I mean, during Ronald Reagan's second term, we don't know who was really running the show.
Yeah, Nancy was doing a lot of it.
Yeah, and she was she had her astrologers that she was talking to as well. So that's a very legitimate concern. Number two is the simple fact that you can look at the track record for Biden throughout the course of his time in office, and you can see that he has never taken a progressive position on anything. He's effectively a Republican, and this is one of the reasons why the Democrats lose every single time, because why would you vote Democrat when you can get a real Republican, right?
Yeah.
So I do not see him and his run being successful against Trump. Quite frankly, should we see a Biden-Trump race come November, I really firmly believe it's going to be a Trump win.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that the party is playing some shenanigans, and I think that the party likely has another candidate waiting in the wings if and when Biden has been deemed incapable or incapacitated in some way. But their whole point was to rally around a consensus establishment candidate and quash the rising of Sanders. And that happened immediately before South Carolina. We saw at that point Buttigieg had more delegates than Biden, yet somehow he caved. Klobuchar caved. They all caved in lockstep. I don't know what they were promised, but they were promised or threatened, whatever. But they all rallied around Biden, and I just, it boggles the mind to see why the party would do that. Again, when you are part of the corporatist party and you've got hidden hands behind that really run the show, I can understand that. But this is definitely a demonstration for the lack of democracy, the lack of transparency, and the lack of faith that I think is going to occur with this party with a lot of people. So,
it's just bad politics. You have the most popular and favorable politician in the entire country. So, like, if you were a smart political party, that's who you run. The guy who's popular and everybody likes.
No, it isn't. Not if you think about what his mission is.
Yeah,
his mission
exactly
is to destroy the status quo. And if you are a part of that power base that is built on this tradition that's been this way for 100 years, that is a existential threat to you. So I understand, and I can understand why they would do that. Now, you posit the idea of Bernie breaking off and forming a third party. I really thought that he was going to do that last cycle with Our Revolution. I thought Our Revolution was going to be that third party. Fact of the matter is, we have a two-party system here, and I do not see the viability of a third party, not with the way that our elections are held currently. So with the first past the post type of election system that we have, it makes it incredibly difficult. You've had maybe 2, maybe 3 opportunities where a third party has actually succeeded. And I'm thinking Jesse Ventura in Minnesota. And I'm thinking, just lost my mind about it. The other one. Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Coming very close with the what was it, the bull moose?
The bull moose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, the system is not set up for third-party wins. In order for a third party to truly be able to succeed, you're going to need something like HR 4000, which is the Fair Representation Act, which provides a ranked choice voting type of scheme.
Mhm.
You would need that in order for us to break away from the lesser of two evils type of choice, because you've seen in the past with a H. Ross Perot, with a Ralph Nader, that they were very popular, but they still only were able to garner 5 or 12% of the vote. So, if ever there was a time for Bernie to really have struck that third party, I think that would have been after the shameful results of the 2016 primary. That was the time to do so. But at the same time, he had a very small window. I mean, I think that, after the horror and the shock of the Trump win, people were so afraid they wanted to just kind of unify and come together and coalesce to defeat Trump. And they're still trying to do that. But I think, again, they've gone about it the wrong way, because, again, the party leaders are really focused on self-preservation above all. And quite frankly, if it were between a Trump and a Sanders presidency, the party still does better with the Trump presidency than it does with the Sanders presidency, because Sanders would break up the status quo while Trump will continue more of the same.
That's a fair analysis. I can understand that perspective. I think for me, part of it is the desire for that third party, simply so that I partly don't throw my vote away every time. I tend to vote not for the Democratic. I didn't vote for.
Well, the vast majority of folks don't vote at all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is a whole other thing.
So, and that's also by design, because, again, our system is not for the people's will. It's for, let's turn out the votes that are going to get our guy elected, right?
Right.
And mainly our guy. But the system and the people in power don't want the people to choose. If they did, we would have a nationwide ranked choice vote by mail system. We would get rid of these debold machines and all the shenanigans that go on with that. We would get rid of these inequitable polling systems, where we have 3 polling stations for a college and 100 for a senior citizens location. Yeah. All of the machinations, all of the things that are done within our electoral process are done in order to sway, influence, disenfranchise votes, because really you're doing everything you can to influence the ultimate result. Because, again, those in power get to decide what happens, and politics is all about who gets what and how. So, again, we keep the people down, we keep them suppressed with low wages, we keep them occupied with diversions, and we keep them docile. And that's the whole point. They don't want to see an uprising of the people.
Yeah, and here we play the Star Spangled Banner. But yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that for most people, especially like you said, most people just don't vote. Either the system, it just doesn't feel like the system affects them, even though sort of clearer minds know it does affect them. And the second one is just like, who cares? That if everything is fundamentally the same,
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if a Dem wins or a Republican. My life still sucks. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And the Democratic Party doesn't help me any more than the Republican Party does. Mm-hmm. And if anything else, the Republican Party tells me to my face they don't care, whereas the Democratic Party tells me they care and then punches me in the face.
Yeah, the paid for opposition.
Yeah. All right. Well, those are like most of the questions that I had, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure that we do cover? I wanted to give you the chance to talk about or explore anything that you think is important and you want to get out there.
Yeah. So first of all, here in our district, we're almost 80% Democrat. That means 20% of us don't really have an opportunity to select the person that's going to represent them. We are in a closed primary state. that means you have to be a Democrat in order to vote in the primary. Now, the primary, May 19th, is really when the decision is made. It's not made in November. Whoever the Democrat is from this result will ultimately go on to win in November. So if you want an opportunity and a chance and you live in the 3rd district, I implore that you go and switch your party affiliation to Democrat. Hold your nose, whatever you have to do. If you're a Republican, if you're an independent, if you're a non-affiliated voter, do so by April 28th so that you have an opportunity to vote for someone that's going to work for you. You know, my politics are on the left, but I understand and appreciate the need to represent all of us. We need somebody that's going to represent all of the people of the 3rd district and not just those at the very top. You can find out more about me at albertlee2020.com. Thank you.
Awesome, man. That's great. I wish you the best of luck. I know it's an uphill battle, and it's even harder with COVID. It's a crazy time for all of us, but it's definitely a crazy time to be an insurgent politician.
Indeed.
So and I would say an insurgent representative. I noticed that difference you made. Right. They're a politician. You're a representative, and I agree with that for sure. So hopefully, future Representative Albert Lee. Thanks a lot for being on the Sensible Socialist podcast, and good luck to you.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.